It is my great pleasure to welcome my good friend Jean-Claude Trichet back to Harvard University and to the Kennedy School of Government. Jean-Claude Trichet has had a remarkable career. For 25 years, he has operated at the pinnacle of the international financial system. In 1985, Alan Greenspan did not yet contemplate that he would become chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And Jean-Claude Trichet was named as the director of the French Treasury, in which position he guided French financial affairs and in which position he was responsible on behalf of the world for organizing the many debt reschedulings that were necessary for all countries. He served in that position for 7 years, and in 1993, he was named as the head of the French Central Bank. No other French central banker from now to eternity will have responsibility for the French franc. He was the last man to have control of the French franc. Anyone who knows anything about Europe knows of the centrality of France to the design of European arrangements and to the carrying on of the European integration project. In the fateful years in which monetary union was designed and then implemented, Jean-Claude Trichet had a crucial role as the steward of France's central bank. And then, in 2004, Jean-Claude Trichet assumed the responsibility as head of the European Central Bank, took responsibility for the euro's maturation as a currency and its role in the international financial system. Jean-Claude may have expected, and I suspect he did hope, that after 22 years at the pinnacle of the international financial system, his last 3 years would be calm and simple. It was not to be. Following events in the United States, the world found itself in financial crisis. That crisis spread to Europe, and the European monetary system found itself in the gravest crisis of its short life, and what I suspect most Europeans hope will be the gravest crisis of its first half century. It fell to Jean-Claude Trichet to manage that crisis with complex events in Greece, complex events in Portugal, complex events in Ireland, the possibility of extremely portentous events in both Italy and Spain. He drew on all of his extraordinary experience to do just that. And on this, his first public trip to Europe since stepping down, public trip to the United States, since stepping down as the head of the ECB, we are very fortunate to have him reflect on all that he has learned. The Kennedy School is a school directed at preparing people for public service and to serve democracies. I can think of few, if any, individuals who have served so long and so well in such significant positions as Jean-Claude Trichet in Europe. Please welcome Mr. Trichet.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Larry, for this introduction, which is so kind, so flattering, that it reminds me the introduction, which not in Harvard, but in another place, terminated by, and it's a pleasure to present the man who made billions of dollars in discovering oil in California. And the speaker was a little bit embarrassed, and he said, well, can I correct a little bit what has been said? It was not oil in California, it was coal in Oklahoma. I have also to confess it was not billions of dollars, it was millions of dollars. And I have to reveal that it was not a profit, as a matter of fact, it was a loss. But very fortunately, it was not me, it was my brother. So, no, it's only to reflect that I am very moved by what Larry said. We work together in various Gs and in various circumstances, and they were always very demanding, obviously. And it was always an honor and an immense pleasure to work with him under his, I would say, leadership. And let me also say that I mentioned the fact that we had to cope with enormously difficult challenges over the last period of times, and it's not only the privilege of the 5 or 4 last years, but we had a lot to cope with all over the world over the last 35 years or something. And it seems to me that here, in this sanctuary of academic excellence, which Harvard is, which Cambridge, which Boston is, where you really feel physically that you are in a sanctuary, again, of excellence. Perhaps it would be, for me, interesting to try to convey very simple messages that I draw from the experiences that Larry mentioned. I will first say just a few words on my own reading of the structural adaptation of the global economy which we are experiencing. Then I will concentrate on a little bit on monetary policy and on standard and non-standard measures to give a sense of how we have understood the concept of standard and non-standard and the principle of separation that we have applied. Then I would say a word on the lessons to be drawn on academic research and, of course, also central bank research on modeling with the experience of the crisis, which had been quite cruel. And then I will conclude again with very simple messages on Europe. First, the structural adaptation of the world. I am absolutely struck to see that over the last 35 years, we have seen progressively and successively the various continents adapting themselves and learning the hard way that they had to adjust, and they had in the new world, in the new emerging world in which we are progressively plunged, that they had to be sure that their policies were sustainable in the medium and long run. we had to cope with, and it was particularly, of course, an immense responsibility for the advanced economy themselves and for the US, we had to cope with the collapse of Latin America in the 80s. All countries in Latin America went bankrupt, but Colombia. And it was a very, very dramatic succession of events. We did not feel it too much in the advanced economy. After all, it was what we call the periphery, and we considered there were good reasons for the Latin American to have to cope with such difficulties. A full continent, an entire continent, and as I said, only one country had not to change drastically its own strategy, its own policy. With a lot of pain, a lot of effort, adaptation, structural adjustment are never easy. Then we had also Africa. A very, very large part of Africa was in a major difficulty. We had the Middle East. Egypt had major difficulty. Egypt had to reschedule its debt, and the creditors had to accept also haircuts. We had the Central and Eastern European with Poland, and we had Soviet Union. Soviet Union itself collapsed. So Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and the eastern part of Europe with Soviet Union. In a way, at that time, there were good reason to think that this was, in each case, commanded by absence of correct management, particularly, of course, flagrant in the case of Soviet Union, absence of sufficient attention to appropriate and sound policies. And the Asian, as well as the advanced economy, were thinking, not for us, of course, because we are correctly managed. Only to discover at the end of the 90s that the Asian themselves might have major problems. In the previous crisis, only Philippines had been touched. And then in this episode of the structural adaptation of the global economy, we had Asia, a large part of Asia, a large part of emerging Asia. At that time, the advanced economy were thinking that it was not for them. And I have to say that with this perspective, over 35 years, I had only the globe in front of us, and we have pushed the globe, and we have seen the various continents. We were the last ones not being touched by coal, which was a very, very strong coal in 2007 and until now, to adapt and to be sure that we could convince the rest of the world, the investors, the savers, our own people, our own public opinion, our own enterprises, and our own household that we were running policies that were sustainable in the long run. So I consider that what we are experiencing since 2007 is a global crisis concentrating on the advanced economy. And I have to say that from that standpoint, it seems to me, as Larry said, we had first that global crisis of the advanced economy concentrating on the United States as the epicenter of the crisis, but those in Europe who were saying, this is the problem of the US, not for us. The subprime is the US problem. Lehman Brothers is a US problem. We are plain wrong, of course. It was a global problem. And we could see it was a question of half days after Lehman Brothers that all the financial signature in the advanced economy were touched. So again, a global crisis of the advanced economy which calls for appropriate structural adjustment. And we could see, of course, at the end of 2009, the epicenter of this crisis crossing the Atlantic. The best summing up I can give is Ben Bernanke at that time pointing his finger on me and telling me, now Jean-Claude, it's your turn. And it captured pretty well the fact that, to have a global crisis of the advanced economy is one thing, but to be at the epicenter is another thing. And then you have to learn the hard way what to do. So I thought it was useful perhaps to have this vision of, okay, it means that we have to learn all the lessons from this for this period of time, that we have all to convince again the rest of the world and all the observers that we are in a sustainable mode. And it is true, in my opinion, for all advanced economy, particularly true for the European, because they have not only individual issues that they have to solve, but they have also a collective problem. They have a collegial problem that they have to solve, which is governance in the euro area in particular. Let me now concentrate a little bit on the monetary policy. When the crisis erupted, all central banks engaged in new measures that were not in the textbook. New measures that were not as simple as adjusting the interest rate at the appropriate level or monitoring the reserves of the commercial banks. Ourselves in Europe, we decided as soon as the 9th of August to embark into the unlimited supply of liquidity at fixed rate for a very short period of time. It was a 24-hour period of time, but we thought it was necessary to maintain appropriate order in our money market. And I have to say that this concept of introducing the unlimited supply of liquidity has been something which proved to be, for us, for the European, a very, very important non-standard measure that was appropriate in our case. In the United States, the Fed had a very different attitude, and the non-standard measure were very much purchase of securities on the market. It's not surprising that on both sides of the Atlantic we have embarked in very different non-standard modes. The financing of the European economy is in normal times done by the banks, by the commercial banks, in an overwhelming proportion of 80%, 75-80%. And the markets are only financing, say, 20 or 25%. In the US, it is exactly the reverse. The markets are financing 75 to 80% of the economy, and the banks are financing only a relatively small portion of the economy. So it's not surprising that the European Central Bank had concentrated on the banks and the refinancing of the banks, and that in the United States of America, the concentration of non-standard measures have been very, very much on the markets. Now, let me say how we have understood ourselves the appropriate way in our own case to deal with this standard and non-standard measure. We considered first that we had to make the difference between the standard measure and the aim of the standard measure for us are to maintain price stability in the medium and long run. This being considered as not only, of course, our mandate, but also something which is very important. Solid anchoring of expectation is very important in time of crisis, and particularly this solid anchoring of inflation expectations in particular. And the non-standard measures in this perspective were designed to cope with abnormal functioning of our monetary policy transmission. So that you had to be sure that you were really commensurate to the anomaly in the functioning of the various markets that are playing an important role in the monetary policy transmission. Not surprisingly, when we decided to embark in the first example of non-standard measure in our case, it was, as I said, the 9th of August 2007, and we had a money market which was totally disrupted. So we were not the master of our own interest rates. We considered that we had to prove that we were the master of our own interest rates. So, separation principle. Interest rates are at a level which is exactly what we judge is the right and appropriate one to deliver price stability. Non-standard measures commensurate with the abnormal functioning of markets. Of course, the non-standard measures themselves have to be examined because they might have a number of counterproductive effects which should not be neglected. And I don't want to elaborate too much on that, but it seems to me that it is reasonable to consider a number of conditions which have to be met to be sure that the non-standard measures are not themselves introducing elements that could be dangerous in terms of functioning of our economies. The first condition would be that they must be commensurate with the degree of disruption of markets. I already said that. In the most recent period of time, the ECB went up to a 3-year refinancing of all commercial banks with illimitted supply of liquidity and at fixed rate. Fixed rate deserves some explanation because it is the average over the period of 3 years of the MRO rate, the main refinancing operation rate, which would be decided. So it's itself an average, but an average of the main refinancing operation which would be decided, if they are decided, by the central bank. But of course, one could say when you do that, which was, in my opinion, exactly commensurate with the difficulty which was observed as regards the transmission of monetary policy in the system as a whole, you have to be sure that you are not, permitting the banks to behave improperly and to think that they don't have their own effort to redress their situation and reinforce their balance sheet, that the countries themselves are not taking advantage of the situation, not to do the job that they have to do in terms of appropriate management of their own economy, and that the Europeans as a whole are not themselves forgetting that they have to improve their governance. So the central bank, which decides a non-standard measure, has to be very keen on sending messages to the other partners in order that they would not take unfair advantage of the situation, if I may, and be complacent in a situation where complacency is the worst thing, the worst attitude to have. And that is something which is extremely important. I would add, at the global level, that it seems to me also that as a constituency of central bank, all central banks, which are all now embarking in a very high level of non-standard measure, different but all adapted and commensurate to their own economies, should be keen on being sure that at a global level they don't permit the partners, the G20, the FSB, the other partners, not to do the job that they have to do, because otherwise we would take advantage of the, I would say, responsibility of the central bank in these exceptional circumstances to permit, again, the rest of the entire world not to do the job which is necessary. When I say that this is a generalized problem, this expansion of the non-standard measure, I have to give myself a number of figures that are quite striking. If I take the total amount of outstanding monetary policy operations, so all the abnormal operations that had been introduced since the start of the crisis, I would say that in Europe, in the euro area, it represents 15% of the GDP. In the US, it represents around 18% of the GDP. In England, around 21% of the GDP. And in Japan, around 27% of the GDP. I could go along this evolution through another grid, which would be the expansion of the size of the balance sheet of the banks. There I have concentrated only on the monetary policy measure. And then I have figures that are also quite striking, at least for the central banks but Japan, 170% expansion in Europe and 231% in the United States. It's less in Europe because we have a big own fund and capital structure, which is not the case in the United States of America. But whatever the figures, you see that we are, since the beginning of the crisis, in a situation which is pretty abnormal. It's absolutely abnormal that our economies are functioning with a formidable, permanent or quasi-permanent help of the central bank for amounts that are considerable. I consider that this is fully justified because we are in exceptional circumstances, fully justified provided the messages that I was mentioning for the other partners, namely, finally, the governments, the parliaments, the public opinion at large, and the various colleges, the various constituencies concerned, Europe on the one hand, and the entire globe, the G20 on the other hand. But I have to say that this calls for a lot of academic research. I am in Harvard. We have to understand better because this has, appeared under our eyes. At times, one would say it is the usual behavior of that central bank or that other central bank, or it is the attitude of the Japanese, which is inappropriate and so forth. We are all Japanese now. We are all Japanese. We all have embarked in non-standard measures that, again, were highly unexpected before the crisis, are justified, but call for a much better understanding. And I think that this calls for me to say just a few words on the lessons from the crisis for macroeconomics and finance theory. Einstein said famously, I don't know whether it is as famous as that, but I like that. He said, theory is when you know everything and nothing works. Practice is when everything works and nobody knows why. It looks like we have remarkably put together theory and practice. Nothing works and nobody knows why. And it's a little bit the situation in which we were put in 07, 08, at the start of the financial turbulences and after Lehman. I could say that when the crisis came, the serious limitations of existing economic and financial models immediately became apparent for all of us. Arbitrage broke down in many market segments as market froze and market participants were gripped by panic. Macro models failed to predict the crisis and seemed incapable of explaining what was happening to the economy in a convincing manner. As policymakers during the crisis, I have to say that we found the available models of limited help. As a matter of fact, I said myself publicly, in the face of the crisis, we felt abandoned by conventional tools. And I think that we should understand much better, and there again, there is a lot of hard work to do by, I would say, academic in general, and the connection between academia and practitioners. Because relying on a single tool, methodology, or paradigm is absolutely dangerous. We need to have input from various theoretical perspectives, from a wide range of empirical approaches. And I have to say that open debate and diversity of views have to be cultivated in all time. It's not necessarily very easy, particularly in a central bank, but really the main lesson of the crisis is that it is absolutely necessary. It doesn't mean that we have to throw the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model or the asset pricing models, but that we have to develop complementary tools to improve the robustness of the framework that we are relying upon. And let me only mention 3 avenues that I think are promising in this respect. I think we have to better understand and characterize the Homo economicus, which is at the heart of any model. It's clear that the atomistic optimizing agents underlying existing model do not capture behavior during a crisis period. We need to deal better with heterogeneity across agents, interaction amongst heterogeneous agents, to entertain alternative motivations for economic choices. I think that agent-based modeling dispenses with the optimization assumption and allows for much more complex interaction between agents, and I have to say also permits us with very simple models at the level of the agents themselves to see and understand better the emerging property of the whole. I think, second, that we also have to consider a much richer characterization of expectation formation. Rational expectation theory has brought macroeconomic analysis a long way over the past 4 decades, but there is a very clear case to re-examine the assumption, and a lot of hard work, but very interesting, has been and is underway on new concepts such as learning and rational inattention. And third, I think that we need to better integrate the crucial role played by the financial system in the macroeconomic models. It's a very, very usual comment, of course, after the start of the crisis, to say that better understanding how the real economy is coupled to the financial system is of the essence. I have to say that from that standpoint, we were encouraged in the ECB by our two-pillar analysis. You know that we have always had an economic analysis and also monetary analysis, which means monetary and financial analysis, where we were working on the dynamics of the components and counterparts of the monetary aggregates. So this is, a domain in which I consider absolutely essential. We have really to work much more. And from that standpoint, I note in particular that the U.S. has been a little bit visionary in this respect, because as soon as in May 2006, so before the start of the crisis, we had the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the U.S. National Academy of Science, which were organizing a conference entitled New Directions for Understanding Systemic Risk. I think it was a very good title. A few months, finally, before the start of the crisis. New Directions for Understanding Systemic Risk. And I don't want to elaborate too much, but I could speak 1 hour on that alone, because clearly we have in the domain of the hard science a lot of concepts which seems to be particularly interesting when you are dealing with economics. And not surprisingly, we can go along these avenues because they need a lot of computation. So the computing has been so marvelously progressing that there are things that we can do now, simulate a very large number of agents and understand, as I said, the emerging property of these agents. I don't resist quoting Keynes there, which is a little bit paradoxical, but I was reading again what he says when he speaks of the so-called beauty contest metaphor for understanding better the markets. And what he says is exactly the following. It is not a case of choosing those faces that, to the best of our judgment, are really the prettiest, not even those that average opinion really thinks the prettiest. We have reached the third degree where we devote our intelligence to anticipating what average opinion expects the average opinion to be. And there are some, I believe, who practice the fourth, fifth, and higher degree, as if we were speaking, of the second, third, fourth, and fifth derivatives in mathematics. I must say I'm very impressed by this introduction of the fourth, fifth, and higher degrees. After all, today's quants are utilizing calculus and, of course, are very at ease with such a complexity. But it captures, it seems to me, and it was really a visionary by Keynes, what happens in periods where a systemic crisis is unfolding. At that time, it is not the price of an asset which is at stake, The theoretical issue is not the convergence of the herd of market participants on a particular value. It is the system as a whole which is judged by highly correlated intelligences anticipating what average opinion expects, what average opinion expects the average opinion to be. I remain at the fourth level of Lord Keynes. I don't go to the fifth and over. In crisis period, it might function, it might be an emerging property of this system where the sophisticated filter which is embedded in this might pretty well be totally binary. Either the system collapses or it does not. And when I reflect more on what has happened after Lehman Brothers, it was clearly that an immensely large number of participants were thinking that if there was not a game change, a dramatic game change, the system would collapse. And it was the emerging property of their meditation on the first, the second, perhaps the third or the fourth filter. And I have to say that in the recent period of time, when you look at what was the emerging property of the markets, when looking at Europe, you can also think that they were embarking in November and beginning of December in some kind of binary conclusion. So these are only examples, but examples that were not suggested by traditional, I would say, economics. And it seems to me that the main lesson of the crisis is that perhaps we can explain the expansion of the balance sheets of the central banks of the advanced economy by the fact that they have to reduce the tail risk that emerges from the functioning of the system as it is today, that the market could be seized up, that a full system could not be able to continue to function as we are all expecting. I said that I had a last point, which would be the conclusion, future of European integration, very shortly, because I think that I have to let sufficient time for question and answers, and I'm sure that the question will be very, very incisive, and that I have to give appropriate answer. So let me only say that the main lesson for the European is that they have to improve their governance. I'm speaking of the European as a whole, of the 27, because don't forget that the European Union is a single market with all what it means, which is very bold, extremely bold in terms of ambition, but particularly for the euro area, which is a single market with a single currency. And the paradox of Europe is that if you look at the fundamentals of the euro area as a whole, you have a situation which is balanced as regards the current account, more or less, which is less difficult than in Japan and in the US as regards the yearly deficit as a proportion of GDP, and which is much less grave than Japan as regards the outstanding debt as a proportion of GDP. But the problem is that we are not a whole only. We are a whole because we are a single market with a single currency. And we are not a whole because we have various fiscal policies, various economic policies. And that's the reason why, of course, it's absolutely essential that there is a framework for fiscal policies and for economic policies, and that there is also, of course, a very, very solid perspective for implementing the framework at the level of the control and monitoring of the college of the country, what we call the Eurogroup in our jargon. And the central bank has always been on record to ask for that, not only full implementation of the fiscal framework, the Stability and Growth Pact, but also introduction of a monitoring of the unit labor cost, of the competitive indicators and of the imbalances inside the euro area. I wrote a letter in 2005 to all governments to tell them you have to introduce that. And I trust that the two are as important. I mean, they are both very, very important. We have now the European semester. We have the six packs, the new secondary legislation, which will reinforce Europe. And we have also the new treaty, which will put at the highest level legally the new rules. I trust, but there I am, of course, as is reasonable, expressing myself as a citizen, not as the former president of the ECB, but I really trust that we have to go further and that it is legitimate to ask the question what we will do tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And I said publicly already that tomorrow it seems to me that we have to go further and practice some kind of fiscal federation by exception, if I may. So when a country behaves very improperly, take the risk of having immense problem itself and put at risk the euro area as a whole, it should be possible to, with the appropriate precaution and with the appropriate decision making, to take decisions that would impose by themselves to that particular country. So it would not be a normal situation at all, it would be an exceptional situation. And it seems to me also that in a longer term perspective, but perhaps I am entitled to say that in the Kennedy School, I could say that the European, which had only one role model, which was the United States of America at the end of World War II, have now in front of them China, India, which are of the size of the European in terms of GDP, and which will go over and above the European in terms of GDP at a time, certainly already over for China as regards the purchasing power parity. So we have to be very, very clear on that and be sure that we go further in terms of unity of Europe. So it seems to me it's not absurd to imagine that the overall Commission represents the anticipation of a future executive branch, which probably will not have all the powers of the U.S. executive branch, but will have much more power than today. That the Council, which is the College of Governments, is the anticipation of the Senate, of the upper chamber of the European institution. We have already a lower chamber elected by universal polling, which is the European Parliament. We have already a Supreme Court, which imposes its jurisprudence all over Europe. So again, it seems to me that this is legitimate. And then we would have a member of this executive branch, which would be responsible for economy and finance, and he will or she will do what is necessary to practice this federation by exception that I have already mentioning. I think he should have or she should have enormous responsibility as regards the financial sector of Europe, because we have to decouple the banks and the financial entities from the countries themselves. And of course, the representation of Europe and of the euro area in particular in the global arena would be a natural, of course, responsibility of this entity. So I said that I concluded on Europe and the future of Europe. I would stop there and thanking you very much for your attention.
I'm going to ask a first question in a moment, and then we will take questions from the floor in sequence from these microphones. I am instructed that it is a Kennedy School standard to remind you that questions as we define them here have two salient attributes. One is they are short, and the other is that they end with a question mark, which is an interrogatory. I will attempt to model that. Jean-Claude, the original Maastricht Agreement that provided for European Monetary Union, provided for budget discipline, provided for penalties if budgets were not achieved. In the event Germany and France had excessive deficits and the penalties were waived, what gives you hope that a new mechanism will be better enforced than the old one?
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Larry. First of all, you're absolutely right. In 2003, 2004, when Germany and France in particular were about to see the start of the decision-making process driving them to sanctions, to fines, they exerted maximum pressure to block. It was a very painful experience. It was an experience where the central bank was in opposition with the three major countries. Of course, Italy was also part of it, and it went up to a trial between the Commission, backed by us, and the Council. And there was a Solomon judgment after the trial. I think at the time, the three major countries of Europe were not only totally ignoring that we had a quid pro quo, we had no federation, political federation, no federal budget, but a single currency, and the Stability and Growth Pact was the quid pro quo. They didn't understand that. I have to confess that most of the economists, the mainstream of the economists, was more or less suggesting that the Stability and Growth Pact was too tight a jacket, and that it was not good for the European to have too tight a jacket. The markets were not making the difference, as you might remember, between Greece and Germany, not only in 2003 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, even 8 after Lehman Brothers, it was still the case. So we really had a generalized benign neglect. So what makes me more confident is that we are learning the very hard way that complacency and benign neglect is extremely dangerous, exactly like the Latin American realized that in their time, and the Asian, and all the other countries and continents I have mentioned. But we have to remain very, very attentive, very alert. I fully agree with you, and that is really a major question. And I mentioned that one of the conditions for the non-standard measures to be legitimate was particularly that. I have to say that Mario Draghi is making the point each time he speaks, he says that. Having seen all the difficulty, all the political difficulties of the various countries, I tend to consider that learning the lesson, that dramatic lesson the hard way, will certainly make the implementation of the new rules, which have been considerably reinforced, much more, I would say, likely to be applied. But again, question ultra legitimate.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Sitza Gofard. I'm a freshman at Harvard College. Monsieur Trichet, you are obviously at the helm of the ECB during what is clearly the Eurozone, or what has clearly become the Eurozone's greatest challenge, greatest time of crisis. Looking back objectively, how well do you think you and the ECB responded to the crisis? And on that note, do you have any regrets as to the decisions you or the ECB made?
History will say what has been done. I would only say that we take all our decisions collectively, all the decisions which have been taken by the ECB. Of course, it's exactly the same in the Federal Reserve Board. You have a college, and the decisions are taken by your college. And I really trust that it is extremely important, particularly in time of crisis, to take decisions on the basis of what I would call collegial wisdom and multi-angular perspective. But I will surprise you, I don't regret anything. I think that we took all our decisions, which were very difficult. They were not in the textbook. They were not commanded by any mechanism. They were also incorporating a lot of experience and judgment. And I have to say also that they had to be taken from time to time very rapidly. I mentioned the first decision we took, the 9th of August 2007. We observed that morning in August, in August, everybody is in vacation in Europe, that the money market didn't function. We looked at it, we had meditation, and the executive board, because it was a decision that was taken by the 6th member of the executive board, decided to apply this limited supply of liquidity at fixed rate. We had 2 hours and a half to take that decision. We took that decision. It was a very important global event, I remember, a shock event. And after a week, it was considered by all observers that it was a wise decision. But again, the history will say exactly what we have done is good. I would say lucidity is of the essence. Not only take the right decision at the right moment, but understand much better what you're doing. And I told you that we had a lot of hard work still to do to understand why our economies in the advanced country are functioning now with between 15 and 27% of the GDP in terms of intermediation operated by the central bank that would normally be operated by the private functioning of the operators, financial institutions and markets. So what's behind? And I suggested, I had a conjecture, but lot of work.
Good evening. My name is Katarina Schwartz. I'm also a student at the college. We've seen 2 rounds of bailout to Greece. We've seen much austerity, and yet we still face in Spain, in Ireland we're facing the vote, in Spain we're seeing protests, in Greece we're seeing increased protests. Have we made it through the largest part of the crisis, or will we see several more rounds? And if so, how many more before Europe starts to split up even more? Thank you.
First of all, we have to replace, of course, all this adjustment in a longer-term perspective. When you are in a single currency area, where it is absolutely clear, because it's been made clear since the very beginning, that the benchmark for inflation, the benchmark for price stability is close to 2, less than 2, close to 2. By the way, we produced 2.03% over the first 13 years of the ECB, with several episodes, as you know, of commodity and oil shocks. So all taken into account, it is a very good result, taking into account the circumstances and the fact that we had said from the very beginning what was our benchmark. But when in a particular country or particular economy you see nominal evolution galloping and galloping and galloping, despite the fact that it was obvious that it could not work in a single currency area, and despite the fact that I have to say myself, I circulated the unit labor cost, the nominal evolution of a number of very important indicators, including the wages and salaries in the public service, because they were decided by governments, so it was not the market economy functioning or the social partners, but the governments themselves. So when you are out of a normal evolution of this nominal evolution, you know that you have to correct at a certain moment. And it is, unfortunately, what had to be done in a number of countries, not only, I have to say, the Greece or other countries that are in the euro area, Also in the Baltic, which had currency boards and were totally associated with the euro, and had also an evolution which was, from that standpoint, not sustainable in the long run. So an adjustment is always difficult. There is a great asymmetry in the adjustment. When you're giving much more money than you should have, you pocket it, and I think it's a human nature, normal behavior. You forget it, but you have it in your pocket. But when somebody tells you, you have too much in your pocket because we made a mistake, we gave you too much, so we take it back, which is exactly what is happening, then it is very, very difficult. And this is absolutely obvious. And that's the reason why we must have a very close monitoring in the future. But, you know, adjustment is not easy in any country. And it is not a privilege of the euro area, where Latin America was not at all in a situation where you had a single currency. But it's been a very difficult adjustment. What is clear, and if I may conclude on that, what is clear, and I think it's striking, not only, as I said, the countries that had adjusted before, the continent that had gone through crisis, were formidably resilient in this episode, which concentrate on the advanced economy. But even in the constituency of the advanced economy, Canada has been incredibly resilient. Sweden has been incredibly resilient, and Germany has been incredibly resilient. Only to name 3 countries. It's not the general case, but why were they so resilient? Canada had enormous problems at the end of the 80s and had a very painful exercise to redress its economy, which took a lot of time, but put Canada in a very solid situation in the present crisis. The Swedes and the Scandinavians had enormous difficulty at the beginning of the 90s, a collapse of their financial system. I mean, in a way, a small anticipation of what had become global in 07-08. And they resisted formidably the present crisis. And Germany had all the problems associated with reunification, lost its competitiveness, had a dramatic destabilization, was in public, in a current account deficit in 99, and all over the period of time, starting with the euro, for reasons that were entirely due to the bad situation in which they found themselves, had corrected the trajectory. So you see also, a contrario, those who had problems in the past and, you know, had done the appropriate adjustment, made their own economy and their own people much more resilient in the present crisis.
My name is Alessandro Perez. I am a graduate student here at the Kennedy School and the Business School at Stanford, and I'm from Spain. So when looking at the causes of the financial crisis, and in particular the sovereign debt crisis, it seems there are fundamental differences between the U.S. and Europe. In particular, when a bank fails in Florida, it is a federal institution, the FDIC, that comes to the rescue of that local bank without threatening the public finances of the Florida state or the Florida citizens. When a bank fails in Ireland, it is the Irish government that faces the cost of rescuing that bank and therefore putting it to a huge strain the public finances of Ireland. Shouldn't we develop in Europe a system at the European level to try to decouple the financial sector from the local state finances?
I think you have a very good point. I mentioned myself that the responsibility of the future Europe should be precisely to decouple the financial system from the states themselves. Exactly like in the US, there is no coupling between the state of California and the banks in California, and that, of course, introduces an element of stabilization, of inbuilt stabilization, which is extremely important in period of crisis. So I fully agree with you. It's not easy because it means that you have to count on a European taxpayer able to take important responsibility if it is necessary, and particularly, of course, in case of crisis. But it's clear that it is a particular vulnerability if, of course, the banks on the one hand and the countries concerned on the other hand do not behave prudently and with great care for the sustainability of what they are doing. So I would say that in the present period it would certainly call for applying very rigorously what has been decided, both at the level of the banks. I mentioned one of the conditions for the non-standard measure to be legitimate is that it does not prevent the banks from doing themselves the appropriate reshaping and restructuring of their balance sheet and reinforcing of their resilience, which is decided but has to be applied, of course, and is always difficult to obtain. And I would call, as you do implicitly, for maximum amount of progress in the direction of this decoupling. But let me draw your attention, I don't know what Larry thinks of that, but you have the European problem, and you have also the global problem. You have the global economy functioning, global finance. And I see a tendency now for renationalization or resegmentation of, and totally out of the European issue, but at the level of all other partners that are themselves either full-fledged federation or centralized state. But I see, because the experience of the crisis has been that you are coupled as taxpayer of country X to your own banks, and that therefore the idea that it was extremely important to have a global system that would be as fluid as possible is more or less challenged now. I remember a period where all the heads were saying we must avoid at all price to go back to financial protectionism and mercantilism. And now I hear some who are saying exactly the contrary. We have to be responsible vis-à-vis our taxpayers, and we have to be sure that we don't let our own banks take risk in other countries that would put an additional burden on our taxpayer. And of course, this has consequences in terms of functioning of the global economy. It is something which, again, is by many, many aspects one of the major dimensions where the previous consensus might be on a way to change, which I don't consider would be a good one, obviously, but it comes out of this taxpayer mobilization because of the crisis.
My name is Adrian Arroyo. I'm an MPP1 here at the college. I think it seems that the European monetary authorities have pursued a kind of kick the can down the road approach to the Greek situation. I was wondering whether you think continuing that approach is going to be sufficient to resolve the situation. If so, why so? If not, what would that final resolution look like?
There's something in your question I don't understand. You mentioned the monetary authority. You're meaning all governments, European institutions?
Yeah.
The central bank had no major responsibility at all in the
Yeah.
decision.
I'm just asking for your perspective on it.
Pardon?
I'm just asking for your perspective on it.
Yeah, no, I understand. So I think, again, this is something which has to be examined, considering Greece, considering what Greece has done in the past, considering that in any case, what you call kicking the can down the road means for the Greek, certainly not kicking the can down the road. They have the sentiment that they are adjusting, and that they are adjusting, as I said, I trust that it is absolutely necessary, because in any case, whatever happens, the adjustment would be necessary. You cannot eternally spend more than you earn, or much more than you earn, or immensely more than you earn. So you have to accept it can be done in an orderly way, or it can be done in a disorderly way. We have example of that being done in an orderly way in the world, And we have example of that being done in a disorderly way. In the second option, the pain of the people is much more. The pain of the country itself and the, I would say, the way the country is hurt is much superior. And of course, you have also to take into account the impact of other part of the system, which is something which has to be taken into consideration. Not only the other member in that particular case of the euro area, also the region, the sub-region, the way, the impact that a totally disorderly event could have on other countries that are not in the euro area in the region, which is the Balkan, which is a region which has characteristics that are the most, certainly tense that you could imagine in this, in our continent, in Europe. So again, a lot of good reasons to make, of course, the orderly adjustment the first best by far, far, far. And I have no doubt that the decision that have been taken by governments, the government of Greece, of course, is the first to take decisions, but also by all other governments and by all partners concerned, has been the best decision. There is no good decision when you are in a very difficult situation and where the policies of the past were very bad. You have to adjust. But there is always a first best.
Hi, my name is...
question and one more.
My name is Andreas Schaap. I'm a student at the college. Since the crisis, and to some extent even in the years before, progressive research has been done on alternative communication strategies and regimes, such as price level targeting, and on additional unconventional policies, such as IOER use, which has been pioneered, I think, by the Central Bank of New Zealand, and policies such as micro and macroprudential prudentials. However, at this point, it seems that on both sides of the Atlantic, central banks continue to maintain, in a long-term perspective, thus disregarding one-off measures such as long-term, large-scale asset purchases and stuff. Central banks seem to maintain their more orthodox approach to monetary policy. So my question would be, very simple, where do you see monetary policy headed in the next, maybe in the next decade? Thanks.
It's very, very good to be told that we are not sufficiently unorthodox and that we are too much conservative. I have to say that from time to time, I think it is true on both sides of the Atlantic, we have the other criticism. You're much too bold, much too unorthodox, and how are you sure that all what you're doing is legitimate? Again, I really trust that it's a little bit paradoxical to tell us that we don't do enough when I told you that we were all taking a part in the functioning of our economies, which was unthinkable only 5 years ago. Only 5 years ago, you would have said the balance sheet of the Fed and the balance sheet of the ECB will represent 19% of the GDP for monetary policy operations and 15% of the GDP, it would not have been considered credible. So it shows that we have certainly accepted to be up to our responsibilities, which are very heavy, vis-à-vis our, I would say, fundamental responsibilities to maintain the appropriate non-inflationary stability of the system. And I have also to say that it means that we have to permanently reflect on whether we are sending all the appropriate messages, because otherwise the risk is that we would progressively accept as a permanent new normal a situation where clearly we have the reflection of an abnormal functioning of our market economies. I mentioned the fact that we were in different universe. I think we can understand pretty well why our own non-standard measures in Europe are different from the US non-standard measure. And so there is not absence of appropriate explanation when we compare the various central banks. One of the area where there has been a remarkable convergence between major central banks is the definition of price stability, because now we have approximately the same definition of price stability on both sides of the Atlantic and in the advanced economy the world over. The Fed says 2% or slightly less than 2. We say less than 2 but close to 2. So I have to say that looking at the semantics, it's difficult to see the difference. And macroprudentials are absolutely essential, and I think that we have a consensus to consider that macroprudential are essential, and that the issue of how do you prevent systemic risks is the key issue. And I mentioned that en passant, including when I mentioned the necessity for academia and for the central banks to understand much better where we are. We have embedded in our system now systemic risks that have of first magnitude. The central banks were on the first line to combat and counter those systemic risks, but they were about to materialize. What we have to do now is to prevent from being about to materialize, and the solutions which have been given on both sides of the Atlantic are very close. I mean, even if it is not exactly the same new institution, as you know, in Europe, we have now a European Systemic Risk Board where the central bank plays an important role, not exclusively, but an important role.
Last question. Thank you.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Matthew Schoenfeld. I'm a third-year student at the law school here. First of all, thank you very much for coming. You had touched on it when you'd spoken earlier in terms of the laxity that was seen in the EU with respect to enforcing things like, let's say, the 3% deficit rule, laxity seen in the early 2000s that kind of led to where we were today. And I think that Professor Summers' question touched on it as well in terms of enforcement. I mean, no matter how objective enforcement criteria are, there's still going to be some subjectivity, as we saw with Spain last week, in terms of allowing them to kind of expand upon the 4.4% in terms of their deficit for this year. How do you deal with that subjectivity when you're asking countries to surrender some sovereignty? I mean, you've already seen accusations of differential treatment between Spain and Hungary. How do you deal with those issues?
First of all, I would make the difference between those who are in the euro area and those who are not, which are not in the euro area, because again, those who are not in the euro area have not an impact on the stability of the euro area of the same nature. Even if, as I said, the 27 have also an intimate link and are a much closer constituency than is generally suspected. But that being said, I think, first of all, two remarks. One is that the sanctions, namely the fines, were already a formidable imposition on the sovereignty of any country, because clearly it means if we are not satisfied by your government, and if we are not satisfied by your parliament, because your parliament might not follow what the government wishes, then we will fine you. So your parliament is behaving not properly, we fine the country because the parliament doesn't take the right decision. After all, it is the parliament who is the decision maker for the budget. So that goes very far. I had myself to defend that in the French Constitutional Council, and it was their main problem. They understood that the currency would be merged. Okay, that's clear. But why, they were asking, do you impose fine on a parliament which would not behave properly? And I explained why, because of the interaction and the externalities of behaving improperly in one particular country on all others. But experience has demonstrated that when you are in a difficult situation, the threat of additional fines was a little bit abstract. And we could see also that major countries try to avoid that. That's the reason why I really think that we should go further. Not further in terms of, attacking, quote unquote, something which has already been done. Namely, we had already the sovereignty of the country at stake. So it would be exactly the same from that standpoint, but it could be much more operational. Imposing a decision instead of imposing a fine is much more operational and might, of course, be the right way to proceed. Now, all this is taken with a particular decision-making process. These are not abstract decisions. So it will be, in the new regime, much more systematic, more automatic in a way, but with the appropriate influence of the Commission, which has to be fair, and with the appropriate decision-making, which is the decision-making of the Council. So what has been improved is the fact that we have reversed the burden of the proof in comparison with the previous system. So the Commission should say you should do this and that, and to avoid that this would be the decision of the Council has to get a majority against the position of the Commission. So I think the system has been improved. But a judgment is always necessary, of course, at the end of the day. And again, they have learned, all of them and all of us, the lesson the hard way. So again, it seems to me that the Europeans know now what it means to be complacent or to practice benign neglect. That doesn't mean they should ignore reality, but they know the price of being complacent now, very clearly, in all countries, because I can tell you, we are speaking of Greece, we are speaking of other countries that are under adjustment. We mentioned Ireland, we can mention Portugal. You have also the countries which have to get from their parliament appropriate help to complement the IMF or whatever for the various countries. And I was recently in Finland. I can tell you, you have also to explain a lot of things in those countries. So they are all learning the hard way, to which extent we are intimately interconnected.
Jean-Claude, thank you for demonstrating your tremendous powers of analysis, your vast experience, and your great wisdom. You have given us a great deal to think about, and we are very grateful.
Thank you so much.